Hey, is this thing on? Feels like I could never get this broadcast to ever work properly. But today we have a pretty strange story from a listener of this station. As you all know, this is the so-and-so station on 95.6 FM, where we bring you some of the more spooky stories, especially when we're in the spookiest month of them all, October. The viewer left out his name for the sake of anonymity, so if that doesn't unsettle you already, maybe the actual story will shake you to your very core. Now in this letter, the guy says that it all started in a small town he lives in with his grandmother, and on a particularly restless night, the guy had to walk to the convenience store for more cigarettes. His grandmother, worried for her grandson, tried to convince him to stay in for the night, being that it was pitch black out, but the grandson thought nothing of it. However, when the door closed behind him, he realized just how pitch black it really was. Walking down the trail in the pitch black woods, the grandson said aloud to himself that it was so dark out he finally understood the expression of it being so dark out you could barely see your own nose, and begged the question that this is what it must have been like all the time before electricity was invented, as he went for his pocket to light up his final smoke. But where it gets really scary, folks, is when the grandson went to light a cig, the flash of light from the lighter showed a demon-like face right beside him. The grandson felt fear like nothing he had ever felt before in his life. And then the story just ends. And I'd say that's a perfect time to go for commercial, folks. When we're back, we'll get into...
What you just watched was a short story from quite honestly one of the most scariest mangas I've ever read in my life. In a total of 6 volumes, all written by Masaki Nakayama, are comprised of short stories that leave you each time after reading viscerally terrified. And when I tell you that these stories still stick with me months after reading them, I'm not lying or trying to do some YouTuber dramatized thing for views. There were actual times where I never wanted to touch the pages or even turn them because I was afraid of what I'd see next. And knowing the backstory behind this book, it made it all that much more terrifying, feeling 10 times worse as I kept reading and reading. Now, I'll get into the backstory in a few, don't worry. But I more kind of want to talk about the very eerie thing about this book that I encountered in real life, where it almost felt like some presence was luring me into reading it after I had discovered it online. For instance, the book had a set release date for all 3 volumes, containing 2 volumes, if that makes any sort of sense, and they were each all a month apart. And I mostly read everything physically, so this was kind of a bummer, you can imagine. Only after the next couple days, I ended up going to my local bookstore, and I found volume 1 just there. I read the first volume all the way through in the first day, and was immediately enveloped in this feeling of fear and dread from short stories such as a man waking up to hear the sound of his sink faucet, and going to turn it off, he finds that it was never even on in the first place, and from the corner of his eye in the shower lies a wet, putrid demon. And the story just ends there, leading you, the reader, left to imagine what could have happened next. And I feel like that makes it that much more terrifying. This type of horror hits a lot different for me when you know it's something undeniably evil, but you have utterly no clue as to why it's happening or what the thing could even be. The best example I could relate this book to would be the movie called Skinamarink. And if you've never heard of this movie, do yourself a favor and check it out. It's an amazing movie for Halloween. But back to the manga, after I had finished volume 1, I went back to the bookstore the next few days after and found volume 2 alone, just lying on the bookshelf again. Naturally, I thought to myself, it's a little odd to be seeing that book there, given that it wasn't supposed to come out for another month and a half, but I still bought it anyway. And the more and more that I went down this rabbit hole of reading these short stories, I started to piece together a couple things. Now, in the corner is the station of the radio the stories are playing on, and sometimes the station numbers will be in the same frequency, meaning that there's a chronological sequence in which these short stories are all meant to be read. And throughout the stories, the one consistency is this totem that people would pray to, known as the god of hair, known as Agushi. And whenever people would be inclined to worship Agushi, they would cut their hair for the god and pray by saying the phrase, pray pull, pray pull. For a long time, Agushi was worshipped, but as time went on and old traditions were forgotten, this hair god became angry with the people of the land and cursed everyone. This entire theme is carried throughout the stories for you, the reader, to puzzle together on your own through all the absolutely disturbing pieces of imagery. And when I tell you that by the time I had finished volume 2 of this book, I wanted to cleanse my eyes so badly, because with each volume, the story gets darker and the scary factor gets amped and amped, to the point that when I went to the bookstore a week or two later and saw volume 3 alone on the bookshelf once again, over 2.5 months before its release, it felt like the book was actually calling to me at this point. Part of me didn't really want to even keep going, but the book had a sort of presence about it that made me feel like I had to see it through to the end. But long story short, I ended up buying the final book and reading it, and if you remember in the kind of sort of beginning of this video, I stated that this book had a really disturbing backstory. Well, this is the part of the video where I'm going to talk about that now. So the story basically goes that PTSD Radio's creator rented a building as an office space 8 years prior to Volume 5's release. One day, he heard scratching around the ceiling and attic, which was also a little bit weird because nobody else rented space in the building except for him. Looking around, Nakayama eventually found a broken shrine, and at first he thought really nothing of it. Then odd things began happening, like scritching around the ceiling, lights going out unexpectedly, and the smell of raw sewage coming from the front of the building. One of the very inspirations for some of the twisted faces is even how his landlord's face contorted in anger after a misunderstanding on a rent payment after 6 years without a problem. The more he stayed there, things began to get much worse, because when they moved spaces, Nakayama developed an inexplicable hematoma around his mouth and was diagnosed with a disease called ITP right after he drew up a similar scene of someone throwing up blood and having demons spawn from it. He was forced to stay in the hospital for a few months for treatment for this rare disorder in which platelets are destroyed and prevent blood from clotting to heal the body. But one of the creepiest and arguably horrific stories that inspired PTSD Radio was the assistants seeing shadowy figures around the office. Whether it be full-blown people or just crows at the window that were closed, everyone that came into contact with those things either suddenly quit or fell ill. This included Nakayama himself, as one side of his face suddenly swelled up like a balloon and his temperature dropped. Yet when he rewrote his idea to say no more, he suddenly felt fine. And anytime he would try to write down the story or try to explain what was happening to him or even progress PTSD Radio, the same thing would keep happening. So for the preservation of his own health, he just vowed to never keep writing PTSD Radio ever again. So the book just ends with a to be continued. And Nakayama even states himself that if he can somehow continue PTSD Radio without his face blowing up like a balloon or feeling the presence of a demon lurking over him, Nakayama states that it will continue as of Volume 7. But here's the problem. That was well over 5 years ago in 2018. So since there's no official word as to whether or not it will actually continue from the official producers, many readers have considered PTSD Radio concluded as of now. And I take it as though he was warned, and now so are you. So I guess until anyone hears anything from Nakayama about PTSD Radio ends with the extra creepy bit of a mysterious ghostly voice breaking the fourth wall in a jump scare to not talk about the story. It does well to let sleeping dogs lie sometimes, because when one gets so paranoid they start hearing voices or seeing shadows where none exist, that's a pretty good indicator to me to stop whatever you're doing. This may also include watching this very video or just not reading horror manga at 2 a.m. Especially not this one, as it has given many people fears of dark spaces. Me especially. It took at least a good month or two to get over this utterly terrifying book, and I guess in a way I'm putting myself at risk yet again, making and editing this video with feeling existential dread every time I awake from brutal nightmares of this book. But that's not to say I wouldn't recommend this book at all. I totally would, because it's amazing, and I personally think that anything that can leave a long-lasting feeling on you after reading, watching, or experiencing something is a work of art. And to this day, I still so vividly feel the dread of each turn at that page from this series. There are also so many different short stories to pick from that could be your personal favorites. Among some of those short stories is one I really love, where a man returns to his apartment complex, and every day when he climbs the stairs, he sees a woman standing outside an apartment door, never moving, just standing at the door. It's only when days pass and the man stops taking the stairs in fear of dying or something that the point of view changes to the owner of the apartment, hiding in the corner of her apartment as the woman outside the apartment is revealed to be this demonic creature poking its head through her door, just looking at her. It sends shivers down my spine. But yeah, you should totally go check out PTSD Radio, and whatever you do, don't look at it. If you say, you'll never be the same again. I'm glad I said that last part, because it was really important. But I hope y'all like this video, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and as always, I'll catch y'all on the flip side.